We would love for you to tweet out or share through your desired social media platform all the learning from the Literacy Symposium. The hashtag is hashtag PA Lit Symposium 2020, which you can see over my shoulder. Okay, I am going to turn this presentation over to the three ladies who will be spending time with you this afternoon. So Erin?
Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Eimy, and I have with me Lisa, Lisa Coleman Bolla, and Laura Lamont. And Lisa, Laura, and I have been working together supporting teams across the state of Pennsylvania in MTSS and literacy for the past at least 5 years as TAC and now in their positions as patent consultants. I'm from IU5. Lisa?
I've met Pat in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh office.
Pat in Pittsburgh as well.
And we are here as good friends and colleagues and really wanted to put together this session to share with you some of the resources that we've uncovered and wanted to also share some of the features of some resources that we have created to try to streamline the process of data teaming. So we wanted to share some key points to help teams and encourage them to engage in better conversations and decision making around their literacy data. So welcome today. The lineup is a little daunting, so we're so honored that you chose our session, and we're hoping that you get a lot out of it. So today,
especially at the end of the day and a long day of learning. So we'll try to keep it fast paced and keep you engaged.
And it is feeling like summer out there. So we are going to try to have you actively participate. We're going to have you respond to some polls in this virtual environment that we've all been living with. So hopefully, you know your way around Zoom. But if you are a novice to Zoom, at the bottom you'll see a toolbar that it will hover. It kind of hovers and you have to let it pop up sometimes. But we're going to launch some polls and they should show up right on your screen and we'd like you to answer those. We'd also like you to think about questions throughout the presentation and pose those questions to Karen, our moderator. And we have embedded pause points for you to reflect and jot down some questions or reflections. And then we're also going to use some nonverbal signals. So in your Zoom toolbar, you'll have a participant icon that you'll want to click. And then you get a yes or no option to select. This is a quick formative assessment for us in Zoom. So go ahead and find that and we'll take a look to see if everyone knows where that is. We have about 100 of us. So just click yes if you found it. And if you can't find it, obviously you can't click no, but you can let us know if you're having trouble with that. So right now we have 46, almost 50. So we'll just let that go, and if you have trouble with any of those features, let us know. There is more. You can clap or raise your hand, but we are going to be taking questions at the end of the session today. So like I said, just jot down your questions or reflections, and we'll ask that at the end. So Lisa is going to launch a poll for us right now, and we'd like to just see who we have here today with us. So go ahead and respond to the poll. Kind of like the drama of waiting for everyone to respond. So far, we have 33% of you who are interventionists. We have some others. So I'm hoping maybe we have some parents in our audience as well. We have coaches on here with us today, 11% educational consultants, and 13% or 10 of you are teachers. That's great. So we had about 80 people respond, and Lisa will share the results with everyone. So we're excited that you're here, and we're hoping that we can give you some great things to take away from today's session. So we've created some resources for you. They are going to be housed in a Wakelet, which is an online repository. And if you are in the Schoology folder, you'll see that we downloaded that as a PDF for you. But we've created some unique materials. It's called Preparing a Data Meeting, and also some Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 data meeting resources that you can post in your your rooms that you're having data or in your environment to keep your goals focused. So those that Wakelet resource will be shared with you at the end of the presentation, and everything that we're sharing throughout will be linked there. So today we planned this session around these two main learning intentions. After this session, we want you to be able to walk away with the ability to explain and implement the problem-solving process, and to plan and implement instruction based on data that will lead to increased student outcomes in reading. Students are our central focus. It's not about the data, it's about our students, and we really want to make sure that we're changing our instruction to reflect their needs. So if we look at the problem-solving process, the problem-solving process is central to the idea of data teaming. Using this model, teams will be able to move beyond admiring the data, right, to analyzing and utilizing that data. And the goal is to improve not only school level or grade level data, but district level and student level data across the continuum. We're focusing on literacy skills, but this idea of problem solving can be applied to any component of instruction. So our central question is not, right, what about the student is causing the performance discrepancy, but what about the interaction of the instruction, the curriculum, and the learning environment should be altered so that all kids can learn. The shift, right, and thinking about it this way alters everything. So we're going to be talking about an acronym called ICE, right? And it's a little foreshadowing here about instruction, curriculum, and the learning environment.
This is the Pennsylvania MPSS framework, which reflects the outcomes-driven model. The triangle in the center depicts the interaction of academics, behavior, and social-emotional learning. These are all influences that drive student outcomes. Today, we're going to focus on the academic portion of data meetings. The ideal is that teams would integrate meetings and analyze data around behavior and plan with all components in mind so that students can be successful. The triangle also reminds us of the continual supports that we need to provide to students in order for success. Most, or 80% of our students, should be meeting universal screening benchmarks with only core support. Some, which would be about 15%, should be able to meet screening benchmarks with some strategic supports in place, and only a few, 3 to 5%, will need intensive supports in our system. Pennsylvania is committed to the science of reading and utilizing evidence-based practices through a multi-tiered system of support. These are the tenets from which we work to support students so that all learners become skilled readers. As we progress through this session today, we need to agree upon these shared understandings through our community of practice. We're going to explore these shared understandings a little bit further. Reading is not natural, it's a complex linguistic process. Most students are able to learn basic skills in the primary grades, and universal screening is essential to the problem-solving process. Additionally, data teaming is a process, it's not an event, just a one-time thing. Our goal is to have 100% of students at benchmark. Let's look at these a little closer. Lisa, could you launch our poll? Please answer these questions. We're just gathering those questions here. We'll give a few more seconds for you to respond. We've got about 70 responses.
That's pretty good. 80% says. I think I'm going to stop the polling.
Okay, so if we take a look at our responses, we said as a group that we thought that approximately 63%, the majority of us said that, but in actuality, approximately 80% of students can learn basic reading skills at the primary level when we use research-based core comprehensive reading programs. Our second full question, we did pretty good on. We know that research tells us that all but 5%, 2 to 5% of students can be taught to read with interventions and supports. We're well on our way to sharing those understandings as a community of practice. Let's take a look at shared understanding number 3. For the purpose of this presentation, we're assuming that schools are implementing a universal screening protocol. These are some of the characteristics of effective universal screeners. Universal screening is preventative in nature. We conduct it to identify students who may be at risk for poor learning outcomes. Universal screening assessments are typically brief, administered to all students, and when necessary, it should be followed by additional testing or short-term progress monitoring to corroborate students' risk status. Attention should focus on fidelity of implementation and selection of evidence-based tools. Careful consideration should be given for cultural and linguistic responsiveness. Please open your Zoom toolbar, click on participants, and let us know if you are administering universal screeners at least 3 times per year by selecting yes or no. I see the responses are coming in. We've got about 54 folks saying yes and 3 that are saying no. So it looks as though we can summarize and say that we do feel that universal screening is important to the problem-solving process. Let's take a look at shared understanding number 4. This diagram, developed by the Oregon Multi-Tiered System of Support Project, illustrates a cyclical process that leverages data to establish decision-making roles intended to improve outcomes and make instructional decisions. This process includes identifying the problem, analyzing reasons for the problem, developing a plan, implementing that plan, and evaluating our progress. Committed stakeholders are essential to systems-level changes. Knowledgeable teams who strategically embed the problem-solving process across the tiers make decisions to continually improve student outcomes. These teams should engage in ongoing professional development. They should leverage tools aligned to research and plan for sustainability. Embedding this process at each tier enables teams to make data-based decisions and impact the system as a whole, from district level all the way down to student level. The ultimate goal of a multi-tiered system of support is to ensure that 100% of our students reach proficiency. Tiers 1, 2, and 3 are driven by a common problem-solving process, which ensures that teams are operating with collective efficacy. Instructional decision-making occurs at each level of support. This problem-solving process is woven into the fabric of MTSS through our data team meetings. These meetings should occur at each level. We would like to walk you through this cyclical process and think about what happens before the meeting, during the meeting, and after.
So in a lot of our work, we're talking quite a bit about what happens during the meeting, what do we talk about, what do we bring, but we often, that before the meeting set is a missed step in our data teams that can often derail a lot of things that we want to accomplish during that data teaming. So if you go ahead and look at the next slide, our resources, you'll find this handout. This is one of the ones that we created. That is just a useful handout that we thought that we could kind of as quickly as possible capture our thoughts about preparing for a data meeting. We'll refer to this at a couple different points during the slideshow, but you really need to take a look at the 4 bubbles on the side as well as the one in the center. Selecting those team members, making sure that you designate roles, establishing norms, and a schedule are all really important steps to take even before we step foot in a data meeting. Previewing the data is also something that we're going to talk about repeatedly during the training today, just because we want to make sure that it is the step that everybody takes, because it is one that we often see causes the most amount of trouble when we get into the meetings if the teachers don't have an opportunity, or administrators or whoever, to look at that data before we get in there. In addition, you'll find these graphics that we created about Tier 1 data meetings. These are the 5 W's, kind of the who, what, when, and why chart for our meeting at each tier. These quick meeting guides will be easy for you to use and helping you get prepared, and we will also be taking snippets of those as we walk through the meeting. So the first snippet is those team members. So establishing teams. Oftentimes we kind of, if you work in a system as an administrator, sometimes what happens is you just get whoever is willing to come. That's a good start, but we really need to make sure that we become very, very purposeful about who is coming and why they're coming. The team members will vary depending on the purpose of the meeting. At all tiers and all levels, there should be representation from faculty, admin, and any support services that are going to be affected by the data. In our examples that you'll see throughout the day, we're going to focus in on that Tier 1 data meeting. But as an example for a Tier 1, we would need to have all the grade level teachers, a special education teacher, at least one, interventionists and administrators at the minimum. And then anyone else who you can activate as your support team to join you as well. As these meetings become more and more intensive, as the tiers become more and more intensive, you're going to need to include some of those special service providers like your SLP or your school psychologist, and maybe even some family members as we start to look to try to get those children what they need, when they need it, as much as they need. In addition to establishing your teams, you're going to want to set up roles for those team members. So the timekeeper is that person who is just, keeping track of things. We've got one right here today for us, just reminding us that, hey, we've got this much time left and we got to keep moving. So we all need those people to help keep our meetings on track. A data analyst is also somebody who's very useful that can help to look at how they generate data summaries. And the note taker and the decision maker. So all of those kinds of roles are suggestions. They don't have to be exactly what the roles are, but you should really have a secretary or somebody during your meetings to make sure that they're capturing all of the ideas of the meeting. It's often a way by creating roles that you can increase participation of some of the teachers that may not feel comfortable sharing in large group sessions. On the other side is those setting norms. And really, we want to make sure that following an agenda, staying on time are important features, but that's often caused by a lack of interruptions and a good meeting location. So making sure that all of those other things are in place will help you to follow that agenda and stay on track through all of your meetings. Another one is the schedule. So this can be a very complex system. The scheduling component as an administrator in a system can often have lots and lots of different layers in it for whatever data that you are consuming. But when you're implementing that data teaming, it's important you have to plan these things ahead. Your schedule should be driven for data teams around your universal screening schedule. So if you are universally screening 3 times a year, you're going to want to make sure that you're having those meetings after the universal screening 3 times a year so that you can start to plan and think ahead and look back at what the progress is that you've made. So we can include all of those different steps in the problem solving process. Core teams should really meet after those benchmarks. Those schedules can also, as you see across the timeline, the data teams will meet for various purposes, and the systems need to map them out so that you can protect them. So if you know that every Tuesday, a second Tuesday of the month is your Tier 3 meeting, you can definitely protect that time. So to look at the health of the system, you have to look 3 times a year following the benchmark assessment. But during the off months, we'll ask the help of other groups that are receiving Tier 2 support. How are they responding? That can help to ensure refining that curriculum and making sure that we're meeting the needs of all of the learners. The Tier 3 problem solving team will also need to meet as needed, which can be very, very frequent. This is really a student-driven meeting that you have to adjust your instruction based on that progress monitoring. So over the course of the year, you'll connect with these grade level, team level meetings to fine tune those discussions very regularly, sometimes often monthly. We do recommend, and we know that schedules are crazy for teachers, but that at some point we would really like to have weekly touch points for those most needed learners and for people who are committed to that implementation phase. Sometimes in a small system, that's a conversation in a hallway. Sometimes in a larger system that needs to be established onto a calendar. So we did want to get a feel for our audience and just offer a poll question and see how often are you using your data to problem solve. This is the second time we're having a great response to that, as often as needed. So that as often as needed, and I'll share the results with you, is really the key. If you can get there, please try to get there. We do say though, if you're starting with a sporadic schedule, work to try to make that a more consistent schedule. So knowing your entry point, where you're beginning, and then taking the next step to make it more systematic. At no point do we expect any system to start from sporadic meetings every once in a while when I can gather whoever I can gather because I don't know enough subs, to be implementing bi-weekly meetings with their teachers to try to get them to implement data and change. So the small steps are often the ones that we take first, because this really is a process. The best way to look at all of your different resources is to establish some sort of a calendar and protect that time so that all people are present. This is one of the samples that you can see, but it really does take a system 5 to 7 years to implement that multi-tiered system of support. This gradual construction of the schedule is really, really helpful for you to look at, so that you can say, oh, okay, so I'm just going to start with looking at August and September, January and May. And we're going to start there. And then as you grow your system, you can grow your meetings. There are some sample schedules that we have added to the Wakelet as well. We do want to just talk about those pitfalls. So we added this in a couple different times throughout, because in our experience facilitating with data teams, sometimes there are things that just kind of make things fall apart. And you're in the meeting and you're going, oh, if only we could have. And one of those pitfalls is unprotected time. If you are an administrator, we do know how valuable your time is, and teachers as well, and all of those little things that can happen with a parent phone call or the planning time that you need. So keeping that time protected will help to facilitate that meeting more quickly, so that hopefully any situations that arise can be handled after the meeting. And making sure that you stay close to the agenda will help as well. Even if it's 20 minutes, it's better than 40 minutes of people kind of coming in and out as much as they can. The other one is that unprepared member, or those unprepared members. Do make sure that your people who are coming to the meeting are able to preview the data so that they can brainstorm ideas before the official meeting, and that you have this availability of the analyze phase to you and not just the what is happening phase. Did you want to pause for questions, or do we want to keep on?
I think we can just let our participants jot them down for now, and then at the end, we will accept those questions.
Okay.
So our focus is now shifting to during the meeting. In this section, we will visit a portion of the problem-solving process. Define, analyze, and plan. As mentioned earlier, to be as efficient and effective as possible, we must incorporate a consistent decision-making framework. This decision-making framework can be layered across the tiers of support. Decisions can then be made at core review, intervention review, and individual student review meetings. Standardized decisions can be made at each level when teams consistently apply decision rules to this process. Leadership teams should establish decision rules to determine if we are providing high-quality core instruction that finds at least 80% of our students performing at or above benchmark, with only core instructional supports. Additionally, teams can use decision rules to determine which students require an additional layer of support, which should only be less than 15% of the population. Lastly, teams can customize individual student support plans. Ideally, this would be with less than 5% of our population. These decision rules would assist teams with determining who gets supports, how frequently we progress monitor, when to review data, when to intensify the instruction and intervention, and when we might need to refer for a student for special education services. Teams can maximize their efficiency by asking the right questions at the right times. Each meeting has a purpose, an agenda, decision-making rules, and utilizes this problem-solving process. To assist your thinking, we've created a resource which can be posted. These guided questions can be leveraged during your brainstorming and data team meetings to empower you to conduct meetings across the tiers efficiently and effectively. This handout is linked on our Wakelet. The Oregon Department of Education partnered with the Oregon Instruction and Intervention Project to develop several resources to support multi-tiered system of support teams with their implementation efforts. Today, we are utilizing their 100% data meeting agenda to frame our discussion. We have provided a link to this resource on the Wakelet, which will be forthcoming at the end of this presentation. Alternate versions of this agenda are available for Easy CDM and even middle school. In fact, math is coming soon. There are extensive resources available through this project website.
Okay, thanks. So we're moving to define. So we're going to define the problem. What is it? So this is the first step, and we're going to take a look at what this entails. So we want you to think about your system. And if you're a teacher, sometimes the system is sort of a big idea, right? So we're looking at this problem, and the problem sometimes can be difficult to find. It may be at any level. There are several buildings within your system. There's multiple buildings within that component, and then we're looking at multiple grades within one building. We're looking at multiple grade levels in that same building. So we have multiple classes of the same grade level. Then we have individual classroom level data. We have small group data, and we have individual student data as well. So how do we know if our system is working? How do we know if our school at large, right, is learning and on track to read? How do we know if our instruction is effective? How do we know if grade 1 curriculum is effective? How do we know if we're meeting the needs of all of our students? How do we know if what we're doing in small group instruction is effective? And how do we know if the environment is supporting all of our students in our system? So thinking about that 5%, we want to get all those kids on track to learn to read, and we have to use our data to tell us how we're doing. So data meetings help us investigate the health of our system. We're looking at instruction, curriculum, and the environment at all levels, from district to student. And those will be different meetings, as Lisa mentioned before. So decisions that need to be made at the district level, the building level, the grade level, and even small group level change instruction from a day-to-day perspective. What can we adjust across the system to support students who may not be responding to the environment, the curriculum, or instruction? So for today's session, we're going to walk you through a very specific data meeting, and we're going to be looking at the grade level meeting. So the grade level meeting is going to give us an opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of your core comprehensive program and allow us to make necessary adjustments to that core instruction. So we're really staying focused right in on that grade level meeting today. So the problem is defined by data. So whenever we are looking at a problem, we want to use data. We want to have numbers, percentages, right, that guide our decision making. So our expected performance is the benchmark on a universal screener, which most of you responded that you are doing, which is the first step. And then we're looking at that problem as a discrepancy between the current performance and expected performance. So the amount of discrepancy determines the magnitude of the problem. We have developed a graphic that's called the guidance questions for tiered meeting conversations that Lisa introduced you to earlier. So those are things that you can post on your wall to keep focused. And throughout this session, we're going to have an example of a data teaming process to walk you through the steps of this problem-solving model. So the first question that the team will discuss will be regarding core instruction. How do we know if core is effective? So we're going to begin with a report like this. This is the status report that some of you are familiar with from Acadian's reading. It has a pie chart, and this is the composite score for the entire grade level for first grade. Okay, so the beginning of the year first grade composite score. The composite score is the best prediction of future reading outcomes and the best reflection of what student skills are because it factors all the measures together with equal weight. So if we take a look at the green, which is our at benchmark students, and we look at the blue score, which is above benchmark, and we add those two numbers together, that gives us our total number of percentage of students who are at or above benchmark. And so what we're looking for is this number, when you saw that triangle, of 80%. So our 80% of our students at or above benchmark. That is the telltale sign of the health of a system, of a core instruction system. So can we say that core instruction is effective? So for this data set, this is no, right? We know that we need to focus in on core instruction. We can't jump to that small group level or that individual student level. We really need to focus on whole class, comprehensive core instruction, and that is our starting point. So ultimately, we want to write down a problem statement, right, that is precisely defined. This is difficult work, and if you've never done this, be kind to yourself, right? But we've provided for you a template that has a frame to fill in the blanks, and we're looking for W's, right? The question words. The more W's, the what, when, where, why, who, what, and how, maybe you could add an H in there, you incorporate into that problem statement, the more precisely you can react to that, right? And create a solution. So we want to generate a solution or a plan that fits the problem. And so let's dig into some of those W's. And if you're, I guess I'll just go back one slide. If you are already implementing positive school-wide behavior supports, this is what you might be familiar with the TIPS model, which is called the team problem-solving model. So what is the problem? So we saw our grade 1 composite score data. And now we're going to fill in some of those W questions. Let's dig into the individual measures. So here you can see the phoneme segmentation fluency scores. If you're not familiar with PSF, it's a basic measure of phonemic awareness. And the assessor gives students a word, like moon, and asks the students to tell the number of sounds in the word. So they would say, what sounds are in the word moon? Oo, And if they get full credit for that, they would have said those 3 phonemes. So if we're looking at phonemic awareness, this again is grade 1. We want this to be really firm at this point. It's the ability to listen to a word, break it into its individual sounds. It does not require print at all. So right now we have 19% who are above benchmark and 17% who are at benchmark. So would we say that students are solid with this skill? What about this skill, right? Nonsense word fluency measures basic decoding. These are measuring the ability of kids to match symbols to sounds, and whole words read is the ability to quickly, right, automatically blend those sounds into words without sounding it out. So our questions are, at this point, we know we have a problem. Yes, we have a problem. What is the problem? So the problem would be both, right? The priority skills would be phonemic awareness and basic decoding. So let's take a look at what the precise problem statement would look like for this data. So our example that we came up with was only 18% of students in grade 1 at Keystone Elementary at the beginning of the year are at or above benchmark on the composite score. 82% of students are below benchmark due to overall weak foundational reading skills and phonemic awareness and basic decoding. So we know now what our problem is, right? And specifically what skills we need to focus in on. So our priority skills are defined here.
Have to unmute myself.
Move,
So we're
move
going to
to
get to that
analyzation.
analyze step. We're going to get to that analyze step in the data. This is what we're used to doing in our data meetings. This is a lot of the stuff that your TAC and patent consultants can help you really dig into. This analyzing feature is really an essential component to what are we going to do about this problem in the problem statement that Erin was just talking about, and how is our system going to respond? So what's really important is that you kind of, we're going to watch a quick video. Don't worry, there's no sound. I'll talk our way through it. And bear with me if it's a little mistimed, but it's really important to look at what exactly is influencing this data and causing this problem. So if you consider a seed, so we're gonna talk about seeds for a minute. I'm a gardener. That seed needs to go into some soil, and in order for it to really grow and flourish, it needs the right combination or mix of nutrients. It also needs to be watered with maybe some fertilizer, and then it has to have exposure to sun as based on its needs and be at a good temperature. That's really the same idea for our students. If we consider that the soil to be like the curriculum, that right mix of resources, the instruction to be how much we're giving, how long we're giving it, at what intensity are we using the hose, and that environment, right? So how much light is it actually getting, and is that the right kind of light that it needs? So that when we're thinking about our students, we have to consider the same features. So each individual student will actually end up looking at its own environment to see if it's getting all of the things that the student needs to grow. We also have to take that student and then apply it to the system. What is going on in this system that we aren't necessarily getting the results that we want to get, but we are getting the results that we are getting? Could it potentially be something in the curriculum? Is there some sort of a resource that's missing in our curriculum that we need to go and find? In addition, could it be about our instruction? Maybe you do have quite a bit of things for your instruction that you have resources, lots and lots of them. We've been in a lot of systems that they open up the closet door when we say, hey, do you have? And they go, oh yeah, we've had that blocking a door open for the last 3 years. Is it something that we're implementing with fidelity, and are we doing it in a way that's really, really helpful? And then in addition, is the environment of our classroom one that students feel like they can gain skills? It's a growth-based classroom where they're feeling like they can gain confidence with the positive behavior supports and good classroom management and all of those expectations and norms that are important for kids across grade levels. So if we go back and we consider that 18% of students in grade 1, what is it that 82% of them are below benchmark? What are we going to do, and how are we going to look at all of these different factors that could be influencing our data? There's one more step in this process that's really, really important to think about. We have hosta. So this is a hosta plant. For those of you who are gardeners, you know that hosta grow anywhere. They're really, really hardy plants. They're a staple in many Pennsylvania gardens. I've grown it in a box by accident. But they really actually are good. They can grow in a variety of soils. They have lots of different conditions. They're hardy, hardy plants. In contrast to that hosta, you have to consider an orchid. With an orchid, it needs a very, very specific set of soils and fertilizer and attention and sunlight in order to be able to grow like the hosta. So really, most of our students are like the hosta. Most of the students that we teach, they grow. They do really, really well in our systems, and they don't suffer. And they're getting their skills, and we're doing a great job, and they are surviving and learning to read in a variety of conditions. But some of our systems, and sometimes as many as 30% or more, are students who are really orchids, whose skills are very, very fragile. And unless they're given that very special mix of instruction and curriculum and environment, they're really not going to see the success that they had been hoping for. And just as an afterthought, that hosta, and I don't know if you've ever had it happen, but that hosta sometimes doesn't flower. And that can indicate that it's not getting quite the right mix of nutrients. And we have students like that as well. Students that look and sound like they are absolutely on track, and then all of a sudden that 4th grade slump hits and they fall off a cliff. and they just can't reach that full potential. So to make sure that all of our students reach that full potential, we have to make sure that we're amplifying all of these features around them. But as a ray of hope, just like an orchid survives under a master gardener, those people who are experts in the science of reading and are using data-based decision-making strategies really do see a lot of success with these students and a lot of thriving under their instruction. So this is that ISIL by Riot matrix. The Riot is the part that goes to the student, but the ISIL matrix is something that we really honed in on while we were preparing for the training, because it does such a nice, succinct way of drawing in the features that we have to look at when we're doing some sort of a data analysis. Is the instruction taught? Is it taught well? Do we have enough words in this section of the lesson? Are we doing it at a perky pace? Are we working through it? That curriculum is what's there. Do we even have all the things that we need? And then that environment. So do we really believe that only 5% of our students are really going to struggle, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get all of them as far up as we really can on our hierarchy? And if you notice, the learner is last. And the learner is last because really in this ISIL matrix, only if and when all of the other factors are in place do we really look at the learner. Because if there is an instructional hole and the pacing is a little bit slow, or it's one-on-one response, that could be causing some behaviors in the child that may not be able to allow them to focus in that classroom to receive the level of instruction that they would necessarily need. So looking at that learner as a last step. So we had a quick question. If you'll pull up that participant bar again, could you please just let us know if this matrix is new to you? Oh, good. I'm always glad to see when we share new things. So about half the people right now who are responding, half the people are responding, and most of them are saying that this is new. So that's a wonderful resource that you can use to share. So we're going to talk about these common pitfalls again. The data dump is a big one. A lot of times, and it was actually one of the questions that Karen sent to me, a lot of times when they come to the meeting, they're getting all this data. They're getting the classroom data and the student data and the grade level data, and all they're doing is sitting around piles of charts and graphs. And they haven't had time to figure out what they need to do with all of that stuff. Having a purpose and making sure that it's one data set we're looking at. You may have a core team for every single level of your system's data. You might have a core team with representatives from different buildings coming to your central office to look at a district-wide decision making. You may have a building level core team that's with a grade level representative that's looking at continuity across grades and where we're seeing issues. And then that core team at the grade level as well. So making sure that those are focused and making sure that you have the right timing will help with it when you have your data in advance. The other one's admiring the data. Looking and recognizing that we've got a problem with phonemic awareness is not necessarily going to make any change to your instruction or have positive outcomes on your system. It's nice to know that we have a problem with phonemic awareness, but what are we going to do about it? So then we have to plan and implement support.
Okay, so we're going to move to doing something, right, about the data. So we defined the problem precisely, and now we're going to look at what to do. So this is the hard part. This is the good work that you want to get to in your meeting. So in our Tier 1 meetings, we can maximize that time by utilizing this ICE portion of the ISIL matrix. So I, in that form that we shared with you, is for instruction again. And so we're going to look at two prongs of this. We're going to look at what are some common instructional strategies that yield benefits. And we're going to target those instructional strategies to the priority skill that we identified in our precise problem statement. Then we also need to consider active engagement strategies, because if we're teaching, right, but kids aren't engaged, that will also be a problem. So how can we implement those strategies with our priority skill? Then we'll take a look at C, the curriculum component. How can you maximize the materials that you have? Like Lisa said, digging things out of the closet. Good things, you know, aren't always new. They've been around forever, but everyone has to know what are the instructional routines that are effective. Being consistent across grade levels and classrooms are really important. And how can you utilize that time to teach that priority skill? The last one is environment. So how do we increase that instructional time? When we ask teams, what do you need? They say, time! And we say, sorry, we can't do anything about that, right? But what we can do is maximize what we do during the time that we have. So behavior management strategies are one of those things that we can look at to leverage your time that you have with your students. So classroom routines, effective transitions, teaching expectations to make sure that your classroom is running like clockwork, um, and adding in those positive feedbacks. So we want to see a 4-to-1. Every redirection gets a four different positive responses or feedbacks to that student. So we want to focus on ICE, and we need to focus on the professional development to implement the plan. So we can all make a plan, but if no one knows how to do it or how to implement it, then we're still at a standstill. So teachers need to feel confident and competent in order to implement that instruction effectively. So this is the National Institute for Implementation, the network, NERN, and we're looking for our teachers prepared to put the plan into effect. What support will they need? If you're an administrator, this would be your action item. How do we provide professional development, and how do we follow through on that? So the I in ICE, if you go back to that meeting template that's about 4 pages long, this is a section of that template, that meeting agenda. We appreciated that agenda because it contains high leverage practices right there for the team to discuss that will increase student learning. So each of those components of ICE responds to a classroom level application that can be applied to your plan. So there are 2 components of instruction, this instructional strategies and engagement strategies. So how can you see, so here, right, are the instructional strategies that are broken into the categories of I do, we do, you do with corrective feedback. And that is the explicit instruction cycle. So if you had the chance to attend Anita Archer's session before this, but you'll definitely be able to attend the EndNote and visit her website, explicitinstruction.org. That will allow you to dig even further into explicit instruction. So the second component is active engagement strategies. And when we're thinking about basic decoding and phonemic awareness, sometimes this sort of escapes us. What should we be doing about responses? So there's several different types of responses that students can be asked, right, to elicit. So teachers can prompt kids to give oral responses, written responses, or even action responses. I can bet some of you are using gestures or hand signals already. Response cards and slates or whiteboards are all part of that active participation. We want kids to be actively engaged in that process of instruction. So what are you currently using right now? And what could you amplify? What could you streamline to make things more effective? So this is a sliding scale of intensity of instruction. So we want it to be self-reflective and look at how explicit would you consider your instruction. Anita Archer has 16 elements, and we've used those in professional developments for teachers to reflect on the elements of explicit instruction. What do you do well? What hadn't you considered? And what would you prioritize to implement? So the I do, we do, you do, and if you're from the South, y'all do. As a group, right? So those are on this sliding scale. Do you move at a perky pace, and do you offer many opportunities to respond? So if you self-assess, right, and you just kind of track the number of times that you ask kids to respond, and that's not one child, not calling on one person at a time, but choral responses or group responses, and you're at 1 to 2 per minute, we know that we want to increase that toward 8 to 12. That takes a lot of preparation and planning to be able to elicit that many responses. And the last category is that corrective feedback. Are you able to correct almost all errors with immediate feedback? Do you have procedures and protocols for that? And looking at those three components will allow you to increase that intensity level. So increasing the directness of instruction, teaching with a perky pace that students remain engaged throughout the lesson, as well as providing multiple opportunities to respond with that continual feedback will increase the likelihood that students will respond positively to your instruction. So it's a huge component, instruction. So environment is talking about what's going on around us, right, in the classroom. So what behavior management strategies can be enhanced to increase that instructional time? We get derailed by behavior or ineffective procedures. And so some of these components would be, right, giving that positive feedback, keeping kids motivated, engaged in learning, reducing transition time, and sometimes that's a major schedule issue. So even though we're not directly discussing behavior data analysis, those components are always intersecting: behavior, academics, social emotional learning, and it's important to plan with those things in mind as we move forward. So we want to determine the function of behavior of the group. This isn't an individual FBA, but we're looking at group. If students are showing signs of getting off task, um, we're looking for what to do with that, right? We would offer more opportunities to respond. So let's take a look at our next component of curriculum. So when we were looking through this agenda that we're sharing with you today, we noticed that there wasn't really a category for curriculum, which makes sense. This is not something you would do within a data meeting. It's more of a larger process. So we're going to consider what we're using for curriculum. What are the materials that we have? And as part of that system, the implementation of effective instructional materials, such as the core reading program, right, by a qualified teacher is an important part of improving student achievement. And so this tool from IES allows teams in K-5 to assess how consistent instructional materials are aligned with the scientific research on reading instruction. This document provides a rubric, which is very straightforward. It's a beautiful thing to follow the progression, right? What would they say is not met with criterion and what is completely met. And so that is also provided to you in the Wakelet. So a plan is great, but it needs to be implemented. So what supports do your teams need to be able to implement? And this is where professional development comes in. Effective systems have to have skills, the materials, and administrative supports to implement that plan. So professional learning communities provide that safe space for learning and growing and flipping that learning, discussing about what you've learned, what's gone well and what was a disaster. You can learn from each other and really tweak your process. So what supports do you need and to meet that goal? So the big question is, right, what are we going to do about that problem? So we go from looking and reviewing and analyzing our data, right, from our benchmark goals and sub-skills to creating that precise problem statement and creating a plan. So now we know pretty precisely what is going on, what to consider. And so now we're going to make a statement from all of that information, and we're going to include these components: grade level, priority skill that was identified in our precise problem statement. We're going to talk about instructional strategies, engagement strategies, and then when we've picked something to do, how long will we need to do that to see growth? How often, the frequency, right? And those should be progress monitored as well, but we don't have time to get into that today. And then what do we need in order for those things to happen? What professional development or learning focus do we need to take? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to read the sample from our case study. So the elements are color coordinated. I'll just give you a few seconds to read this. So as letters trainers, Laura, Lisa, and I were partial to letters, and we know that Pennsylvania supports letters as an initiative for teacher knowledge. Everything that we wish we would have learned in college is in letters. And what do we do to translate that research to practice? So you see here that this reflection of the professional learning, what we will do, right? The engagement strategies, how frequently, those are all laid out so that the team is very clear on what the plan is. So the more specific your statement is, the more clarity your action plan will have. Everyone knows what they are to do and responsible for. And then we're going to set a goal for the team. So this is for first grade. All 4 teachers, all 7 teachers, however many you have, are going to set the same goal. As a classroom or as a grade level, right? In first grade team is going to focus on basic phonics. We're going to focus on nonsense word fluency, whole words read, because it's going to be the middle of the year by the time we get to the next benchmark. So we want kids to automatically access the ability to turn squiggles into words, right? That's our goal. And so we're going to set our goal at 100% because we know that we want all kids to be at the bare minimum, right? That benchmark is the lowest level of okay. And we want all kids to be there. We want to shift over that bell curve, right? So that we have all kids that are on track to meet the basic reading skills that we know sets them up for success. We need to pull most of our kids out of risk categories for failure. So some of our common pitfalls in this section would be to not have an action plan, right? We've analyzed the data, we've come up with the problem, and then we run out of time, right? So being really careful with that procedure of your meeting and keeping it concise and focused will help you leave that data meeting with a plan. So we want to assign responsibilities, who's going to progress monitor, when are we going to update and share our progress, and when are we going to evaluate, right? That's what that core team debriefing is for, to say, we've been doing this, but I don't see a change, or this is working fabulously, and I think all of our kids are at our goal already. So we want to adjust ongoingly. And then, thinking of programs as solutions. We want to really focus on ICE. We know that teachers teach, and programs are something that help us teach, but they're not what is the central focus. So we want to match student needs to instruction.
We're going to go ahead and shift now into the after meeting. So we've outlined this plan. What comes next? We need to evaluate. We have to ask ourselves, is our plan working? And how do we know? So what would that look like? In order to evaluate, we need to start with step 4 and reflect on our implementation of the plan. So when we come back together for our middle of the year benchmark core team meeting, we're actually going to start with that step 4. Look at our goals that we set last meeting and ask ourselves, does our data meet or exceed our agreed upon goal? Remember, we were shooting for 100% of kids to be proficient with that nonsense word fluency skill. Probe, not skill, sorry. We want to ask, did we implement the strategies we agreed to? Did we implement the core with fidelity? And if we didn't, that's probably why our students didn't meet that benchmark goal. Focus on step 4 at the beginning of the meeting reflects that recursive nature of the problem-solving model. We can revisit our goal, and then we're going to assess ICE to make sure that we are implementing things with fidelity. Growth is another factor to consider in evaluating the effectiveness of implementation. Student growth percentiles allow us to compare students with a similar profile. Students who are at below benchmark and are receiving intervention should be growing above or well above typical growth. And all students in need of core support should be growing at least the typical rates. If they are not, systems should be leveraging this problem-solving process to identify changes that need to be made. Reflect on the diagram of the system. Keen focus on what we can change is critical. Is why we selected the ICE acronym. We can change things about our instruction, our curriculum, and our environment to improve student outcomes. It is important that if negative trends exist, action is taken to remedy the situation as soon as possible. We shouldn't just keep doing something because, oh, that's the way we've always done it. Shifting practice to meet the needs of our student population is ongoing, just as Lisa mentioned earlier. It demands flexibility on our part. Remember, the data drives the decision making, but the teachers drive the solutions. Trust the process. Keep in mind, change is complex and continuous. The managing complex change matrix can be leveraged during these growing pains. We have linked this in our Wakelet, which is coming right up, to support your team as you implement change across your systems.
So we're going to go back to this MTSS framework, and just for one more minute, take a look at that keystone diagram that is the new MTSS adoption model. And I think it's important that you'll see, even within Pennsylvania, you'll see that define, analyze, implement, and evaluate strategy. Those 4 steps are part of our problem-solving model around MTSS. In addition, what you'll see is that we do look at that MTSS as a triangle with that academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning. As you grow up in years in your elementary school curriculum, maybe some of you are secondary teachers or middle school teachers or middle school interventionists looking for some support, those tiers become more and more linked. Often what we see in students in working with some of our, we had the pleasure of working with 9th grade teams this year, is that it's all causal. I don't know how to read, so it's easier to leave the room. It's easier to be funny. It's easier to get in trouble and go sit with the principal than it is to force me into text that I can't read in front of my peers. So thinking about that as a system and making sure that we are responding to those things. The other component that's really important is to look at that idea of continuous refinement. It's a great term, continuous refinement. It really does take 5 to 7 years to eat this elephant of MTSS. It is not a simple process. It is one of the ones that when we look at it, we've teamed with districts that over 5 to 7 years, and they are still refining the time they're spending in intervention and how they're reflecting on the data, and do they need more data points or diagnostic steps. So those kinds of things around that MTSS framework and data teaming are just one step that we need to take in order to improve the student outcomes. So here it is. This is the Wakelet. It's in there, I promise. Yay! And Kelly has uploaded all of the individualized handouts to the Schoology, so you'll see those. She populated those as we were presenting today for us. So you'll get those as ones, and then they're also in the Wakelet, as well as all the other resources that we have featured during the presentation. So if you just take your camera and you hold it up to that little QR code, it will take you right there. Just click on the top and you can open it, and you can always definitely flag it, save it, however you want to. I think, yep, there we go, the learning intentions. So today was about explaining and implementing the problem-solving process. So hopefully you've left our little meeting with some idea of how to explain that problem-solving process to your districts or to teachers or teams that you're working with. The other one was how to implement that instruction based on data. So like we talked about in the beginning, maybe your system is starting at the very, very beginning and you're just in the first steps of data, and you need to adopt a universal screener. Start there. That's a great place to start. PSSA, if you've got a PSSA in the older grades, you can always use that as a gate and implement another level screener underneath it. But in K-2 and even 3, you really need a regular universal screener to go back and visit. Or maybe you're a system that's saying, wow, we have these 12 kids in every grade that we just are not seeing growing. What can we do now? What are some of the conversations that need to be had? Because maybe it's not the right fit. Maybe we need to add something else to our resource.
So we wanted to leave you on this note. It was sort of serendipitous that Louisa Moats published an updated version almost 20 years later about teaching reading is rocket science. And if you haven't read the seminal article, certainly suggest that you read that as well as the update. So we know that we can prevent reading failure in all but a small percentage of children with serious learning disorders. That means most of our students should be at benchmark. It's possible to teach most students when we have those effective practices based in science in our classrooms. And there's nothing more than unlocking the power and the joy of reading that we all want. But kids have to be able to read to love it. And so we're going to move to the questions. We have a few questions that Karen was able to grab from the comments, so we appreciate that.
I think Karen was going to share them with us, and then we can panelists answer them.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. So the first question I have for you, I see on your schedule for data team meetings that you have core team and grade level meetings. Does the core team look at the entire school 3 times a year?
At least 3 times a year. They should be coming together, yes.
Yeah, and I would say, like, we just at every level, just make sure that you're getting all the way in for that benchmark screening, because sometimes we'll see a dip in a skill set of students from one grade level to the next. And sometimes we don't always know what's happening below us to be able to identify that we can support. We didn't realize that, you know, they left. A good example is they left kindergarten and we had 90% of them that were really solid with their phonemic segmentation skills. But when they came back in the beginning of grade 1, they had lost a lot. So what do I do to mitigate that loss as a kindergarten teacher to support that first grade teacher?
Yeah, so usually those are system level meetings or cross grade level components, and that's not usually your whole staff. It's either your MTSS core team or a compilation of people. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Question 2, can you offer some suggestions for when members continually don't come prepared to meetings, even after discussing the importance of them?
I think just support. And Laura, I can see you're going to jump in there, but I think some of the things that we've seen effective were if you're a coach or an interventionist and you feel comfortable with the data, to use one of those grade level PLC meetings as a kind of a pre-teach or pre-review, and they may just be feeling overwhelmed or not confident, and so we've seen that worked pretty well. Laura, do you?
I would also offer that with a strong leadership team, a strong core team, we would have kind of a manual that outlines our MTSS practices and our expectations. So when we establish a precedent for all of our players, all of our team members, that this is I think we use Keystone Elementary way of how we do MTSS here, so that we have these expectations outlined. So we know that we teach kids expectations. Sometimes we need to teach the adults those same types of expectations so that they're coming prepared to those meetings. And we have to get down to business. This is about the kids.
And I think that's where I absolutely will kick into that, Laura. It is about the kids. I think that unfortunately fortunately, I guess not unfortunately, but as teachers, we are so invested in our students. Spending 15 years in classrooms from both urban and rural settings, we love our kids. We want them to be successful. And when we get into data that doesn't look like what we were hoping for, or maybe doesn't represent what we're thinking is happening in our classroom, it becomes very scary and very personal to us. So sometimes what can happen is just remembering there's all of these things in the system that can be affecting the student. It's really not just your responsibility to make sure that everything comes through as a teacher. So making sure that you're having those global conversations. The other suggestion is maybe they take on a different role. So if they are coming unprepared and we really can't break through, maybe they have a different role during the data meeting to stay as a note taker to keep them engaged in the process. And then hopefully they'll be able to come around as they keep going.
Thank you. I think those suggestions are very, very helpful. Before I get to question 3, can you just put the QR code back up for the Wakelet?
Sure.
And then I'll remind everybody that that is available in the Schoology folder as well. So the next question asks, data teaming is new to the school I'm currently providing intervention services to. It's not new to me. Where do you suggest we start? I think baby steps is really important. My thoughts for grade level data meetings.
Everybody else is muted. So I absolutely think that that would be where you would want to start, build some trust and confidence. With your group. Sorry, I'm trying to find there we go. But yeah, something that you can do that's manageable. Make sure that you have an administrator in there and have conversations about expectations. The very first, before you can run a data meeting, I would assess what do your teachers need to know before they can engage in a conversation. So if they're not familiar with the assessments, that's a huge stumbling block that we find. The teachers aren't trained in, let's say, Acadience, and they don't know what the data is telling them, and so they can't engage in a meaningful conversation. So those would be the things that I would start. Start small, assess where they are, and fill in those knowledge gaps, and then work toward problem solving.
And my kick up to that would just be that I would try as hard as possible, because this is often what we find with teams that are new to data meetings, is teachers zero in, and in fact meetings zero in onto one or two particular students. So we want to kind of pull them away from that and get them into the systemic ideas. So yes, we absolutely need to target those one or two students, but we really need to take that global temperature of what our system actually looks like.
Yeah, so Lisa and I are sort of mean about this in data meetings, so we don't allow them to look at their class lists at all until we get to that point, because we want them to look at the big level. We want them to look at either district level or grade level before they start going through their class lists. It's just, they can't not look at it. So little tips there.
Laura?
We have 1 minute left. I'm going to throw this out because a couple people asked this question. Can you recommend some universal screeners? Quickly, top 2 or 3.
Laura?
I would start with Acadience. The student growth percentiles feature is a nice add-on. It helps with really digging into setting goals and comparing kids across different levels of support that are needed. So you're comparing apples to apples and looking at those student growth percentiles. Other ones that are available are Easy CBM. We have Ames Web that is out there. Girls, do you have any others to add?
Dibble's 8th is out there from University of Oregon as well. They also have a growth component to their assessment.
Mm-hmm. Those are the big ones. And then I think, Karen, you had sent the how do we figure out priority skills for our grade levels. If you are using Acadience reading, actually there is a sorting feature. There's a report that you can print out called the grouping report, and each point in time it gives you the most influential sub-skill measure at that point in time for each grade level. So that's important, but we're globally, we're looking at junior skills. So if students are not at benchmark with oral reading fluency, we want to drill back into those sub-skills that lead to proficiency with oral reading fluency. It's definitely sort of outside the realm of today's conversation, but it's maybe a follow-up that we can do because we know that we need to make sure that those underlying foundational skills are solid, and sometimes that requires testing back or using diagnostics like the past and putting those things together. But definitely utilize some of those components from your screening reports.
And I know that we are over in time, and so if you're hanging in there, great. If not, you've got to move on. We totally understand. But that 100% of kids question, is that a common practice? Is it reasonable for teams to use that goal? I just want to reiterate what Erin had said before. That the benchmarks that we see through Acadience and even PSSAs are the lowest of okay. They are, and those kids that they're at 40th percentile. It is not a proficiency modeled assessment. So what we're saying, especially because that's a predictive assessment with Acadience, is that if they are at the 40th percentile or right around there, we call them fragile benchmarks. They have a likelihood or potential to not make them next one, which means that now they are really in trouble. So if we're looking at the 40th percentile, we really should have every single child if we can get them. We know that systems change takes time, and we really understand that you might be starting with a system at 80th with 80% of the students that we've worked in those systems. We completely understand. And so what we usually see is great growth for the beginning, a big jump, and then we see some sussing out of things that we need to be working on. So if your goals right now are just to make sure that we're saying there's 70% because that's half, making up half the distance to 100, there's no reason that you can't. But the eventual outcome goal after 7 or 8 years in this process should really be the 100% if we can get them there.
Thank you. Well, Erin, Lisa, and Laura, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. There are some lovely comments in the chat. The session was phenomenal. It was so informative. I can't agree more. And I am